Tarun, Chhabra, welcome to the Global Technology Summit 2021. I have the first set of questions is on the Quad. In September of this year, at the end of the in-person summit that took place in the United States, the readout highlighted the importance of technology principles in technology design, as well as in governance. Yet we seem to be living at a time in which sovereign principles, rules, and regulations are privileged over transnational ones. So how do you seek to square the circle between sovereign needs and transnational norms?
Rudy, thanks. It's great to be with you at the summit, and thanks for having me. It's a great question, and I think really what we were trying to do with the principles is to square that by making the case that we do have a shared vision for the way that technology should be developed and deployed, such that we can have a set of shared principles while also allowing for each of our national systems to have implementing legislation, regulation, right, that is consistent with our own kind of national systems. And so I think that's going to be really the challenge for technology partnerships and alliances almost across the board among democracies and like-minded countries, where none of us are going to abandon our own systems. We all have our domestic policies and priorities, but at the same time, we do have convergent concerns and approaches, and I think we can square them by coming up with these shared principles and then translating them at the domestic level in a way that's consistent with our own systems.
So that's interesting. So if I'm hearing you right, that almost seems a sort of top-down approach, which is that, and it's bottom-up as well. So you create an architecture, for instance, and you hope very much that different jurisdictions, say within the Quad or like-minded countries, are able to, from the bottom-up, kind of converge at a point that makes sense for the sovereign, as well as for these transnational architectures. But one of the dominant arguments, especially in tech partnerships, seems to be that we're moving into this age of fragmentation rather than consolidation. So sorry to push you again on this question, but it's one that comes up constantly in India and certainly in Japan. Are you seeing that convergence or that compression beginning to happen, or are we at a very early stage of that in the Quad process?
Yeah, so look, I think you're right to say that it's both bottom up and top down. I think that is how it is working, and I think it has to work that way. I think that in terms of fragmentation, this is why we're doing what we're doing right now, which is that I think, among the Quad countries or in the work that we're doing with the European Union, we're trying to make sure that we don't have fragmentation among like-minded countries, or at least trying to mitigate that as much as we can. And I think, if you and I had this conversation 1 year ago, and we looked at a draft of the principles, right, that we ultimately agreed to, I certainly would say, I don't know that we can get there, right? But so I've actually been pleasantly surprised by the degree of convergence that we've been able to achieve, but, don't want to paper over the fact that that is a statement of principles and aspirations, and now we have to go out and implement it to ensure that we are in our own systems implementing those in a way that doesn't lead to fragmentation.
In the US system, and certainly in the White House, you and your team, I can only presume, is one of the key mooters of Quad literature. So Quad grammar when it comes to tech, for instance. There's a good amount of skepticism, Tarun, when it comes to Quad tech. Some of that skepticism may have also happened primarily because of the announcement of AUKUS, which strangely seems to have eclipsed the work on Quad tech, especially the AUKUS announcement on working on critical technologies, etc. Now, in March of this year, the Quad created 4 emerging tech working groups. Could you give us a sense of what are these groups about and what is the end that they're trying to achieve?
Yeah, thanks, Rudra. So yes, as you mentioned, we have 4 working groups. One is focused on advanced telecom, one is focused on standards, one is focused on supply chains, and then another is focused on horizon scanning with a focus for now on biotechnology. There really is a fairly robust architecture in place now that didn't exist before, where we have working groups across all of the countries. In most cases, they're interdepartmental or interministerial working groups for each of the countries, meeting on a regular basis and doing what the leaders said we would do and agreed to do. They're going to look different in each of these groups. In the standard space, really it's setting up the architecture and so that there's constant communication. There is an alerting process when there are standards developments that are of concern or opportunities, right, that we should be seizing together. I think in other areas like supply chains, we could probably be a little bit more goal-oriented. But I think the bottom line is that we've, in a relatively short time, built this new architecture of cooperation that I'm finding is already enabling, not just progress in each of those areas, but it's allowing communication and work together in other areas just because of that connectivity.
In a discussion yesterday, on the first day of the GTS, we had the scientific advisors to the 4 governments come together and talk about what's next. And what seemed interesting is 2 of the key takeaways was, 1, let's institutionalize the work that we're doing on science and tech. And number 2 was, let's not think in kind of brick and mortar terms of creating a Bretton Woods kind of structure, which may over exaggerate what the Quad intends to do. But let's create some sort of a space by which all of this can come together. In the readout in September, there was this big mention of a Quad fellowship, which seems great. Get the best of the minds from different parts of these 4 countries, come together to the US, get R&D working together, innovation ideas. What's the next step for the Quad? It doesn't have a secretariat. It's not really institutionalized apart from the working group. Do you think that the advice of the scientific, advisors is the next step, is creating a structure?
Yeah, so look, I think, the point made by the scientific advisors is really well taken because, part of what we're trying to do is not necessarily create a closed system. I think we want to create a platform for cooperation that is open in many ways. So, if I look out a year or 2 from now, I hope what happens is that there are many other partners who are attracted to the work that we're doing in various parts of the Quad and are joining us. If you take the statement of principles that you started with, we very explicitly say in the principles that we hope other countries would join us, right, in subscribing to these principles. It doesn't mean necessarily every principle, right, but most of them, or as much as possible. So I think that's one big piece of the agenda, is opening up our work to others, right, and attracting others to what we're trying to do. I think we've tried to remain relatively flexible, right, as a result, right, in order to do that kind of work. And I wouldn't want to get ahead of where my partners are and so on. But one of the things I'm personally interested that I would mention is I'd love to see more what some call strategic science cooperation, right? And this has been mentioned by, I think, a number of scientific advisors, where I think, traditionally our approach has often been a purely kind of bottom-up approach to some of our science cooperation. I think we all have, converging priorities, right? Particularly in certain technologies, and I think we could probably find ways to do joint R&D in some of these areas, and that's something where there'd be cooperation between folks in the national security world and in the scientific advisory world, so that's something I'm excited about and hoping we can explore together.
And Tarun, if I just may ask, is that appetite shared in India from the interactions that you've had?
I'll overall, I think across the Quad, the degree of convergence across all of the issues that we're talking about, right, has really been remarkable. I think at some degree, it's a level of strategic convergence. At some degree, it's just, I think an appreciation of the fact that in order to deliver for all of our citizens, we really have to invest and double down and work together in a lot of these technology cooperation areas. So overall, I think if you were just to go visit each capital, ask the same series of questions, I think you would find relatively convergent answers.
So let me switch, Tarun, to a couple of questions on the US and India. Now, this is, of course, it's an incredible relationship, even in the history of international relations. 2 outsized democracies, able to argue. There's a kind of resilience built into that relationship today that didn't exist even 20 years ago. In tech cooperation, there are a couple of mood questions. So India is obviously at a cusp at this point. There's a privacy architecture that's in the making. There's a report by the Joint Parliamentary Committee that will come alive any day now. A privacy bill will become a law. There's a raging debate on cryptocurrency. Should we ban it? Should you treat it as a commodity? Should you treat it as a currency, for instance? And there's the tough business, especially from American company perspective, on rules and regulations in e-commerce. So let me ask a question around challenges first, and then I'll switch to opportunities. What's the challenge that you see in US-India relationship when it comes to India's sort of tech architecture build out? Are you concerned?
So look, overall, I think each of our countries is going to go through a phase of fairly dramatic experimentation, right, in the digital regulation space. I don't think there's any way around that. It's already happening, and I think each of us is doing it. I think it's happening now. It'll probably happen more in the United States. It's happening in India. It's happening in Europe. And I think one of the most important things is that we have to be unafraid of taking a really sober look at how things are working, whether they're working, and then revise accordingly. I know that's very hard, right, when we talk about bureaucracy and regulation, right? But that's just what we're going to have to do. That includes the United States. And so I think overall, if we can try to maintain some degree of agility and have very honest conversations about what is working and what is not, then I'm optimistic about what we can achieve. I think overall, if you talk to a lot of businesses operating in India, I think obviously that the first thing you'll hear is about kind of the regulatory challenges, right? And the 5 or 6 windows in different ministries that you have to visit to get approvals for various things. So those are discussions that I think we can have. If you look on the other side, if you talk about infrastructure, though, for example, if you talk to electronics manufacturers and so on, I think what they'll tell you about infrastructure challenges actually changed quite a bit, in terms of power and water and so on. What the states have done, I think, has been quite remarkable and changed the picture in that space. So overall, I think there's a lot that we can do if we are focused at the highest levels, and I see that kind of focus. So I think the next year will actually tell us quite a bit about what we can achieve together.
So Tarun, let me push you on that a little bit. Localization is going to happen in India at some level. I mean, all the signs sort of seem clear. It's already happening through rules and regulations, through agencies, the Reserve Bank of India, and there's a very high chance that the privacy bill or the law will have criteria for localization of data. Now, under the Trump administration, there was a fairly coercive approach to India on the debate with regards to localization. I mean, informally, officials will tell you that threats were made to India. The White House came very clear to say that, look, if you go down the localization route, X, Y, Z may happen to you, and so on and so forth. How is this administration dealing with the question of potential localization, which will, of course, have a significant impact on American companies invested in India?
Look, I think really what we're focused on is implementation, right? I think that's going to be the key issue, right? And if you talk to a lot of the companies, I think that's where they pivoted really to focus. I think it's important for us to keep our eyes on the overall objective, which is to try to maintain digital flows and commerce overall and digital connectivity between our countries. I think there are ways to do that if we tackle the implementation challenge in the right way. I think from just an American perspective, obviously we don't want to see measures that look like they're discriminatory, aimed at U.S. firms, right? I think, but overall, I think whether we're talking about supply chain security, right, or data security, these are all objectives that we share, and we're all figuring out ways to address them together.
Let me sort of switch to a question of opportunities and the more optimistic side of the relationship. In India, the number of technologists basically pride themselves of building the digital highways of technology. So India Stack, there's a lot of work now on what's come to be known as unified health infrastructure, payments gateways. So it's incredible where the government builds an infrastructure and WhatsApp or Google or Paytm in India can build a layer, and you've basically got a payment system that's ready to go online. And boom, you've got 500 million people using your platform. Where are the opportunities? So, one of the things that we've been trying to advocate is that this is exactly the kind of structure that should be setting the standards across Asia. Is there some thinking, Tarun, in the US, in the White House, about working with India together on digital infrastructure, on building this out in third countries, in Africa and other places?
So look, I think overall there's enormous, enthusiasm and interest here um, in ensuring that we can together kind of harness the scale of the Indian market, right, for many purposes, right. And so that's kind of what you're talking about here. That means sometimes helping drive costs down, right, and it's market opportunities, right, for all of our firms. I think in addition, right, there's the question of the tremendous, skill and education levels, right, in India too. And so, we just tend not to talk enough about talent, right, and how crucial talent is, right, for the digital and technology space overall. So, yes, I think, when we're looking at the deployment of various digital technologies around the world, whether things can be scaled in India potentially first and then kind of move beyond, I think is a really important question that we should be looking at together.
Tarun, just on the sort of India question and perhaps where the cooperation can strengthen, if I can come back to this question around supply chains. So there's a lot of writing and reading about supply chain diversification. But to some of us, it seems actually that what's happening is a degree of consolidation. The 6, 7 companies, for instance, invested in, say, semiconductor manufacturing capabilities are consolidating rather than necessarily fragmenting or diversifying. Is there a role for India, in your view, in sort of looking at semiconductor markets in the future and that supply chain?
Yeah, and I think in the semiconductor market, obviously there has been a lot of consolidation that's come for a variety of kind of structural and economic reasons. And obviously the investments that are required, right, in many cases to get to the leading edge are just so enormous, right? That's driven some of the consolidation as well. From our perspective, we want to see a resilient and diverse semiconductor supply chain. And so, we're certainly making investments or hope to make investments in the United States. At this point, we still have appropriations pending for the CHIPS bill in Congress and hope that it passes very soon. But we're in discussions with our colleagues in Europe about the European CHIPS bill, and we're obviously aware of the initiatives in India on the semiconductor supply chain as well. And we welcome all of them. We think all of them will contribute to a more diverse and resilient semiconductor supply chain, particularly when we think about the vulnerabilities and risks that we're most concerned about. So from a US perspective, I think we want to partner and support a lot of the initiatives that we see underway in India in the semiconductor space.
I'm going to ask you a sort of unfair question now as we wrap up. You've been in the public policy space. You're now in the White House. Is Biden a tech enthusiast?
He's absolutely a tech enthusiast. I mean, I think above all, he sees the kind of centrality of technology in not just strategic competition, but really in ensuring that democracies deliver, right? I mean, that's I think really the focus. And we're having this conversation at a time when we've just had the Global Summit for Democracy as well, where technology has really been kind of a key issue highlighted there. We've had my colleague Eric Lander, the science advisor to the president, talking about democracy affirming technologies. We were looking at export control issues related to human technologies that could be used to abuse human rights. So I think he absolutely sees it as central, both from an economic standpoint, a national security standpoint, and a human rights standpoint.
For the sort of my last question on the Democracy Summit, there's been quite a sort of churn when it comes to the Democracy Summit, primarily because some countries were invited, some weren't, and I'm sure there are good reasons for yes and no. Do you think this is the beginning of a new architecture, or is this a one-off? And I say this primarily because of the point you made about technology architectures and norms. So are we going to see these two kind of paradigms melding together? So democracy, human rights on the one side, and technology concerns on the other? Or is that part of the plan?
I see this summit as really a great kickoff to a series of work and initiatives, right, that are going to be launched over the coming year, right? So we're calling it the Year of Action, but the bottom line is we're launching a number of initiatives, and I think that's really where all the work is going to get done. And so in some instances, we're going to try to develop a new, regime if it's maybe focused on human rights and technology issues, right? In others, we have prize challenges, trying to get the technology and standards moving right around privacy enhancing technology. So it's really about all the work that's getting launched over the course of the coming year.
Tarun, Chhabra, thank you so much for being with us at the Global Technology Summit 2021. And we hope very much that you can be with us in person next year when we return to Bengaluru in what is now called a hybrid format. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Rudy.